I'm sure they can just switch in anytime, because I just gonna hold a little presentation on who am I and who's Nils, our lawyer, and what to expect from the webinar. So first, thank you to all of you guys coming and joining us today on this webinar. I think it really is important to all of us, especially now with, well, not lockdown, but almost anything is lockdown in Germany across. And yeah, also thank you for writing and sending us all those questions. We're really overwhelmed. We received almost around 40 questions, and although Nils will do his best to answer them all right now in this webinar, we will also all collect them together, and we will send this presentation as well as the recorded version of this webinar out to you guys within the next few days, latest next week, so you can record them, share them, or just have a read through again. So let me just introduce myself. I'm Anja from Orgo-S. I'm the senior content manager here at Orgo-S, which is a German company with offices in Madrid and Berlin. So we're already spread across different countries, working remotely for some years. And Orgo-S is an all-in-one HR software that has helped already hundreds of organizations to do the same, meaning absence management and remote work across various workplaces. For example, with our HR software, employees can organize themselves by setting and tracking their own working hours and smooth out communications between people, no matter where they are. And of course, Orgo-S has a lot more features which are concerning in HR, like performance review and goal setting, recruiting. But for this seminar, for this webinar, really the attendance and absence management is really important, because they're really powerful tools to implement for any company to work from home. Yeah, so for example, people can set clear goals and expectations for every employee to be seen on their computers at home, or well, I would have said previously in coffee shops, so sorry, that's not possible right now. They can legally verify templates to amend working contracts in different countries. So basically it's organizing a team from wherever in the world they are, which is really important right now, and also I think in the future. And given the rapid spread of the coronavirus, more and more companies roll out mandatory remote working as well. Yeah, and we would like to help you with this, not only with this webinar, but also with basically our fully automated tools. Yeah, for this webinar, well, we invited Nils Neumann, an expert lawyer in specialized on law or Arbeitsrecht in German. And Nils will try to talk about as many problems as possible. However, guys, please be aware that not all of your questions can be answered in this email, as I said before, in this webinar, as I said before. So collect your questions. If you have any right now, send them there. I will collect them, and maybe at the end we have time to to talk about them. Otherwise, it will be sent in an email as well. Now, let me just tell you, we at Orgo-S, we've decided to give people the opportunity to work 3 months for free with our tool till the 13th of June to make people's life easier and concentrate on what's important right now. And you can use all the features in there. The software gives you peace of mind and makes remote work like easy. And it's 100% GDPR compliant. It's free, and it includes onboarding and all support in case of any questions you have. and you can cancel this anytime. So it's absolutely not to like hunt you down or so. So it's an offer we have right now to help out in these tough times and to stand together. So Nils will start with a brief introduction and general overview of the legal situation in Germany right now, and what the German government is still planning in the next few weeks. And he works at K&L Gates, which is one of the most well-known law firms in Europe. They have more than 1,800 attorneys who work in their company, and he specializes in labor and employment law. So let me hand over the microphone to Nils, and let's start.
Yes, so thanks a lot, Anja, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening also from me to everyone watching this around the world. Also to everyone watching this maybe in a later recording. Just to point out, if you are watching this in a later recording, just keep in mind that we are on March 24th at the moment. So at the time you're watching this, things might have already developed. As you will all be aware, we are in a very fluid situation with the coronavirus, so things are developing very fast, and things which are true at the moment might no longer be correct tomorrow. Having that said, I will be very prudent with the time we have, so I will skip the background information which I have included here about K&L Gates. I think for many of you this will not really be that new anyway, given that we're working together on a regular basis. If we are not yet working on a regular basis yet, then of course happy to talk to you separately after this webinar when the opportunity presents to see if and how we could help you. But let's focus on the actual content of today's webinar. So this is the agenda we want to go through. Quite honestly speaking, I'm afraid we will not really have time to touch upon everything, as Anja have said, but we will we'll be in touch after the webinar. You will get this presentation, and you will get a document with a summary of the most important asked questions for you to read through afterwards. So let's kick off maybe just with the current corona status here in Germany, very briefly, especially for those not living in Germany, so maybe not being aware of the exact current situation. So the situation we have here in Germany at the moment is that we have roughly 30,000 people who have been infected by the coronavirus until today. 130 people have died, 270 people have recovered. It looks like maybe the rising number of infections can be slowed down a bit, but the way I understand it, it's still too early to call a specific trend. So we don't really know yet how the next days and weeks will develop, and that of course will also impact you and your businesses. What we have already in Germany are increasing number of restrictions for public life. So we have limits on possibilities to interact with each other in public, and certain other restrictions. What we do not have yet in Germany is a general government ban or a general order of the government for people to leave their flats. So that is still possible, other than in many other places in the world at the moment. Especially what is still possible for people is to attend work, to go to work, to leave their flat in order to attend work. Nevertheless, we have raising restrictions, of course, for businesses in these times. Some of them are directly based on government orders. So, for example, restaurants and certain shops have been ordered to close. They may no longer open for public business. And of course, we have the indirect general corona impacts of just customers canceling their orders, people not coming to work or not wanting to come to work, and so forth, which will impact your business just on a more indirect basis. German government is focusing on two key issues in this context, of course. Number one, and the most important one, obviously, is health and safety. So primary goal is to keep everyone healthy and safe. But apart from that, as a second layer and as a very important layer, I think the government is focusing on securing the economy, keeping as many jobs available as possible here in Germany. For this purpose, and this is also this second item is what we will be talking about in this webinar. For this purpose, we already have a lot of robust measures in place here in Germany, which have been in place already in the past, which are now being extended and adapted on an ongoing basis to make sure that they meet the exact requirements for companies in these times of crisis. One of them, and the first one on this list, we're going to talk about in a bit more detail later, is the so-called short-term work benefit, KURZARBEIT, also called in Germany, a government-subsidized wage help support program. Apart from this program, there have been various other programs introduced just earlier this week, especially federal and state-funded liquidity programs. So we have available credit programs for companies which are in crisis, and there are now even implemented some direct subsidy payments, which would not even need to be repaid. These especially are for the benefit of smaller companies, and even down to single freelance people working, where they can actually now request direct payments from the government to cover their fixed costs and to cover their costs of loss of business in these times of crisis. Another important aspect which has been introduced are tax-related reliefs for companies. So on the one hand, it is possible to negotiate or to agree with your local tax authority a deferral of ongoing tax obligations, of ongoing tax payments, and also an adjustment of your future annual and monthly payments, kind of advanced tax payments you have to make. Government has indicated that it will be very open, and that tax authorities shall be very open to discuss with companies to adjust these kind of payments and also obligations. I've pulled a couple of quotes, maybe just for a little bit more of background, what German politicians have said about the current measures and the what is currently going on. So what has been said is that Germany will do whatever it takes to make sure that everybody gets through this crisis, not only from a health perspective, but especially also from an economical perspective, that we are putting that the German government is putting all weapons on the table now. They're not really looking at working with small caliber weapons to tackle these issues, but they're rather pulling out the bazooka right in the beginning, and really want to hit this hard and strong, and really want to give all of the companies the support they need to get through this period, and as a consequence to save as many jobs as possible. There was also mentioning of unlimited guarantees for companies, and unlimited funds which will be made available. So reading this, I think it portrays and it shows that German government is taking this really, really serious, and that there are going to be, and there is a lot of help available, but it also shows that the situation really is very serious, because we have not had any kind of comparable measures in the past, not even, I think, even in the financial crisis. The language has not been as strong as it's now. So this really is a really severe situation, and government is aware that they will need to help companies to get through this. So let's maybe touch upon some of the key considerations which will apply for you as an employer and you as a company here in Germany. So just some general concepts and the kind of the first things you need to consider. Many of this you might have already done, but if not, and if you've not thought about this, then it might be very important. So there are three main principles, maybe I would say, or three main pillars which guide us kind of through all of the obligations and all of these rights and all of the applicable laws from an employment perspective in this crisis. Number one is the general duty of care. So you as an employer have kind of a general duty of care to protect your employees, to make sure that they are not harmed. And this also now in this times of crisis means protecting them from possible infections with this virus at the workplace. This general duty of care would be split up into precautionary measures on the one hand, responsive actions on the other hand. So as precautionary measures, it would be very reasonable or even required in these times that you provide certain basic information to your employees, make available sufficient amount of soap or hand sanitizer, tell them to stay home if they feel sick, tell them to leave the office immediately if they feel sick, and so forth. Very basic principles. I think to the most of us this will be very clear, but it's important that you as an employer also make it very clear to your employees and convey this message that they also have a responsibility and that you are watching out for them. Besides of these precautionary measures, I think it's also very critical to take sufficient responsive action. So in case there is a case of a coronavirus within your business, or if you know that someone of your employees or close relative of an employee is put into quarantine, has been in touch with somebody who has been infected, you will need to think about what to do as an employer. So the most drastic step, and something you really will need to think about, is perhaps closing the office where that person has worked temporarily, sending everyone home, leaving them, having them work from the home office, disinfecting maybe areas where the person was working, where the person was touching things, and so forth. So these are the responsive actions, and they will of course always depend very much on the individual situation, but take them serious and think about in each individual case what you will need to do. In addition to this general duty of care, or kind of the second big pillar we need to consider is the employer's general operational risk. So the general principle under German employment law is that you as an employer bear the operational risk. If you are restricted in your business, if you lose business, if now in the Corona crisis you're not able to provide everyone with a sufficient amount of work, then that's generally, from the general principle, that's your problem under German employment law. It's your risk as a company. So we don't have a concept maybe like we have in the US, where you can simply send people on unpaid leave, or where you could unilaterally reduce their compensation and so forth. So all of these are kind of financial risks, operational risks the company generally needs to bear. The only risk the employee bears in this concept is the commuting risk, so the risk of having to get to work. So if someone is not able to get to work, even though the company and the business generally continues, then that would be on the employee, and that would be a scenario where the company would not bear the risk and also not bear the financial consequences. With this in mind, let us look at some more specific aspects. So, as I've said, generally employment continues as it is in this Corona crisis. The employment is not being suspended. People need to go to work as long as it's possible and as long as the company is requesting that. If someone is now in fear of attending work because, for example, they really don't want to use public transport, or they just say, well, I just don't want to go on the street, I don't want to go to work. Generally speaking, that's not possible. As long as the business continues, as long as you as an employer ask people to come to work, they will need to come to work. If they do not, that would constitute an unauthorized leave, allowing you to take disciplinary action. On the other hand, if employees would like to come to work but are not able to come to work because they're ill or because they're in quarantine, this will be considered a general, just a general normal case of continued remuneration here in Germany, where you need to continue this remuneration throughout the illness, throughout the quarantine. Yeah, that is kind of the legal basic concept. What is possible is that you might be able to claim a reimbursement for these costs. So you need to continue to pay people while they're ill. You need to continue to pay people also while they're in quarantine. But you might be able to claim a reimbursement from government institutions. So in case of quarantine, there are reimbursement possibilities with the local health authorities. And in case of continued illness, remuneration payments, at least for small companies, there are possibilities to request payments from the health insurance as a reimbursement. More difficult things will become in case we end up in a general shutdown scenario where employees would be forced to stay at home, but at the same time also business would be forced to close and would not be allowed to continue their work. In these kind of scenarios, under normal current German law, the operational risk would kick in, which we had just discussed, and the employer would generally need to continue the remuneration. But government has kind of identified this as a potentially problematic scenario, and I think there are discussions ongoing that in case we end up in such a general shutdown mechanism, that there might be financial reliefs or further financial programs available for employers, but they are not at the moment. What can you now do as an employer with all these general concepts in mind? So I think there are three things which also in the Q&As, which many of you have submitted prior to this webinar, came up often. One item is you can think about utilizing vacation entitlements, or you can utilize overtime credit people have. So people might now not be able to work a lot because there's a loss of work. You don't have a lot of work available. You could consider sending them home for a certain period on a paid leave. So it wouldn't be an unpaid leave, but on a paid leave, taking some of their vacation entitlements or taking some of their overtime credits. If and to what extent that's possible to implement will always depend on the individual situation. So if you have a works council, this might be much more easy. You could enter into agreement with that works council, laying out exactly how much people need to utilize of their vacation entitlements or of their overtime credits. If you do not have a works council, things are a bit more complicated. And the amount of time you can really send home people might be more limited, but it will still, as a general concept, be possible. Second item, I think, which came up pretty often in the questions as well, is business travel. So generally, business travel rules remain the same as they have been before the crisis. So if an employee under its contract is obliged to conduct business travel, then this obligation will generally continue also during this crisis. However, you as an employer have, from this general duty of care, which we discussed earlier, have a obligation to limit business travel to what is really necessary and to avoid employees being exposed to any unnecessary risks. So in this situation as we have it at the moment, it would generally not be considered reasonable to send employees on regular business travel, especially abroad, especially not in areas for which the German authorities have issued travel warnings. Because just the risk would be too high, and if you would do that in any way, or if you would simply instruct people to travel to such areas, you would expose yourself as a company to a substantial liability risk if the employee on such travel then falls sick, is infected, or perhaps just cannot leave the country anymore because borders are closed and so forth. You might bear all of these costs, which arise as a result. Therefore, at the moment, as far as possible for your business, limit business travel to the absolute necessary, and where possible, rather use telephone conferences, video conferences, and so forth. This brings us smoothly to this third point, which are home office considerations. So if we avoid business travel, where do we stay? Mostly at home at the moment. Some important considerations for home office are that you should be aware there's generally no right for either party to request working from home. So neither the employee can ask you as the company to stay at home as a general rule. So if you want people to still attend the office, you can ask them to do so. The employee has no right to just stay at home as they want. On the other hand, you as the company generally also do not have a right to enforce work in the home office. So it's not in your general discretion to simply shut down the office, tell everyone go home, and continue working from home. Rather, as a general principle, it is required that this is agreed between company and employee. So both sides need to be consensual about home office arrangements. I think at the moment this is not really much of a problem because people are pretty understanding. Most companies are pretty understanding, and most employees as well are pretty understanding. So people are working from home at the moment often, even though they would not need to do so. And of course, working from home at this time can be very effective. It can be very helpful. And it works pretty well, I think, for many of us. But you need to think about the risks and costs potentially associated with this. So on the one hand, people at some point refusing to continue to work at home is a risk. Another risk is that you need to consider workplace healthy standards. So you as an employer remain responsible for workplace safety also in the employee's home office, and you need to consider costs. So if you force an employee to work home, or if you no longer offer him a workspace in the office, the employee could potentially raise cost claims. So partial payment of their rents, partial payment of their utilities. So they might have an increased use of electricity for their laptop, using the internet, using the phones, and so forth. So these are all things just to consider and to think about, and optimally regulating them maybe in an agreement with the employee. So let's move on to short-term work, perhaps. And I'm looking at the clock and already seeing how time is approaching quickly. But short-term work, I think, is one very important topic to talk about. As I've said, this is one of many available government-funded support programs for companies at the moment. It has proven very successful in the 2008 and 2009 financial crisis, and the authorities are currently promising that they are going to take a rather unbureaucratic approach with this benefit, that they will make monies available very quickly, that they will handle applications very quickly, that they will not look at every detail, maybe an incorrect application and look at it too strict, but that they will be rather a bit unbureaucratic about it, and kind of ensure that things move forward quickly here, knowing that companies need the money quickly. What is short-term work, maybe for those of you who have never heard about it? The concept of short-term work provides for a reduction of working hours and a reduction of the remuneration. So an employee who would normally be a full-time employee could be reduced, for example, to a 50% working employee. And in that case, would also only receive 50% of his remuneration. Short-time work can go as low as 0 hours, actually, and then also as low as 0 remuneration, so-called KURZARBEIT null, or so short-time work 0. So in that case, an employee would not be working anymore at all, and the employee would also not be paid anymore at all. All of this can continue for as long as work is lost, so as long as work is not available or not sufficiently available, but generally only for a period of up to 12 months, at least based on current legislation. In case this crisis continues or kind of substantially increases, then then we will potentially look at a longer period, which will be implemented in the future. While such reduction of working hours and a reduction of remuneration applies, there will then be an option to apply for supplementary statutory short-time work allowance payments. So these are payments which will be government funded through German social security systems, and which will make up for generally 60% of the lost net pay an employee suffers. It can even be 67% in case the employee has dependent children. Note, however, that not only it will only cover 60%, so there will in any event be a gap which will not be covered, which will simply be lost, but also note that there are certain caps which apply. So the 60% will not be paid on any remuneration. So especially high-paid employees will suffer more with these with this benefit. They will receive a lower payment covering their lost net pay, up to an amount where they would even receive no payment at all. So somebody who has a really high salary and then maybe loses half of that really high salary, still has a high salary, might not be able to get any payments here at all. What is now new and what just has been implemented is that also social security related costs for employers will be reimbursed as part of this program. So in the past, it was still necessary for the company to pay social security costs on these short-time work allowances. This has now been canceled. They will be fully reimbursed to companies, and as a result, the only thing you will actually still pay is the remuneration for hours still worked, and of course social security contributions on these worked hours, but nothing beyond that. Everything else will be covered by this program and by government reimbursements. Sounds pretty good, I think, but keep in mind there are some requirements to qualify for this benefit, and we have briefly outlined the key requirements here in this list. So number one key requirement is that the reason for the temporary loss of work needs to be beyond your company's control. So generally, and that has been confirmed already, the Corona crisis obviously is such an event. So if your business is directly affected by the Corona crisis, if you lose work due to the Corona crisis, then this fulfills this first requirement. Second requirement will be that a specific number of your employees actually participates in short-term work. And this has now been reduced to 10% of the workforce. So you don't need an awful lot of people, but you still need at least 10% participating in this program. Then you will need a remuneration reduction, a monthly remuneration reduction of more than 10%. So it's not possible to decrease work only by, for example, 5%, but it needs to be at least 10% or more, of course. And then lastly, but also very important, you need to take other reasonable measures in advance. And this will especially include reducing open vacation entitlements, especially relating to past periods. So if you have employees who still have vacation entitlements from 2019, then you will need to make sure that they first take these 2019 vacation entitlements, and only after these have been used up, you can include them in short-time work. The same applies for overtime entitlements, overtime credits. So if employees have a high amount of overtime credits on their accounts, then generally this overtime first needs to be used. So you need to release them from work for these periods, reduce the overtime credit up to zero. In the past, it had even been necessary to kind of bring these overtime credits into a negative amount, but legislation has now changed last week, and it will now be possible, and it will no longer be kind of required that you actually go into a negative overtime credit account. If you fulfill all of these requirements and then generally qualify for this benefit, then you will need to undergo a two-step implementation process. Simplified, outlined here on the slide. First step will be implementing this benefit with your employees. So you will need to involve each individual employee into this short-time work program. This can work a bit easier if you have a works council or if you are subject to collective bargaining agreements, because then kind of the works council or the trade union responsible for the collective bargaining agreement, they can make this determination on behalf of the employees or for the employees. So you will only need to agree on this with the works council or the trade union, and then you can implement it on that basis for every employee. Many companies are not subject to works councils or trade unions. For them, the situation is a bit different. For them, it will actually be required that you approach every individual employee and get an agreement with every individual employee concerning the implementation of short-time work. This may sound a bit kind of problematic or very kind of like as an unrealistic approach, but my experience, at least in the last couple of days and weeks, is that employees, at least at the moment, are pretty understanding of the situation. They know that the companies are getting into trouble. They know that their employer is going to be under lots of stress, a lot of financial burden. And the way I understand it at the moment, many employees are willing to accept to be included kind of in such a short-time work program, also because they know that the alternative often will be that the workforce will simply be reduced, that there will be terminations, and then weighing this kind of against each other, I think many people are saying rather accept a bit of a remuneration decrease than lose my job altogether. I've put here in parentheses a fourth option, a so-called amending termination. So in theory, it is also possible to push through implementation towards the employees unilaterally by terminating the employment, amending the employment conditions. But that is a much more difficult approach, which would need to be looked at into more detail in the very individual case, and something which I would generally try to avoid. So rather try reaching agreements with your employees. If that has happened, so if the individual employees have been included into short-time work, you have reached agreements with them, then as a next step, you will need to go through a application procedure with your employment agency. This will require submitting certain documents to the employment agency, so a loss of work notification. Generally only once you need to submit that, and then afterwards you will need to submit requests for these short-time work allowance payments for each monthly payroll cycle for which these payments shall be made. You will need for these application documents specific company-related information, especially payroll-related information. And often, that's my experience, often your payroll provider will be able to provide a lot of that information for you, so that there will not be a lot of legal work or other work to complete these application documents. But it may nevertheless make sense, of course, to at least have someone briefly look at them to make sure that you have included everything what's necessary, especially as you will need to explain in these documents in a bit more detail how exactly you as a company are affected by the coronavirus, how this impacts your business, and demonstrate for the employment agency how this loss of work has really occurred due to the coronavirus. And then, if things later change, then you might need to submit further application documents. But that is kind of in general the basic process how this works. That brings us through these very first three general parts, and we will now try to look at some of these Q&A questions which you have submitted, as far as we have not already answered them in these first sections. And when reading through these Q&A questions, I have identified kind of these five categories where people seem to be very interested or specifically interested in. So one of them is more details on short-term work. So we'll touch on that in a second. Then also the handling of freelancers and new hires. Also details on home office arrangements. Then how to interfere or how much you are actually allowed to interfere with employees' private spheres in these times of crisis, and then further government support programs, further measures which are available for employers here in Germany. So let us start again with short-term work. So we've just discussed the basic principles, and now let's look at some more specific questions. One question which has been raised by a number of people is who exactly can participate in short-time work. So what kind of employees can participate? Generally speaking, simplified a bit again, but generally speaking, every employee can participate who is in a continued employment relationship with the company. So not employees who are being terminated, because this program aims at kind of keeping jobs, saving jobs, and not providing benefits where the company decides to reduce the workforce. So only employees who are still in an ongoing employment relationship generally. Then, as a second step, it's important that the employee is subject to the mandatory social security regulations applicable for this benefit. This means that the employee needs to be included in the social security for employment insurance purposes. an easy check or easy way to check that whether specific employees are included in this system is just to check the payroll slips for the people, and we'll have one line concerning Social Security, and one of these lines will also include the employment insurance, so-called Arbeitslosenversicherung in Germany. And as a general rule, if for a specific employee these contributions in this employment insurance are paid, then they are also subject to this system and can be included in this short-time work benefit. Certain employees, and this I think was in one of the questions, certain employees such as maybe students, especially working students, will generally not be in this kind of social security system, because they are either paid under a specific remuneration threshold, which is not subject to such kind of contributions, or because there are special rules in the law which explicitly take them out of the system. So they will generally not be able to participate in the system, and this has also not changed, at least until now, with the changes in the law. What is, however, not required is that employees have been with the company for a specific amount of years. So even if someone has only joined the company shortly, they will be allowed to be placed in the short-term work program. Then concerning visas, private health insurance, also pretty specific questions came up, but I've heard that also a lot from clients. So this generally goes in the direction of checking whether the change in remuneration will affect any special employment status people have. So people might have a specific visa which will normally require them that they get paid a specific minimum payment amount, or people might be in a private health insurance which also requires that they are above a specific remuneration level. If they now participate in short-time work, then of course their remuneration, as we've explained, will be lower. But given that this will only be a temporary reduction, this is not a permanent reduction in pay, visa status, private health insurance, and comparable employment statuses will generally remain unaffected. So people will not be harmed with this kind of change. So that is that. Let me just quickly check if I have that. Yes. So another item which often came up then as well was how to handle other specific cases or specific employment situations within the short-time work benefit. So what happens if people fall sick? What happens if people are on maternity leave, if they are on parental leave, and so forth? As a general rule, employment laws remain the same. So people still have a claim for continued remuneration in case of illness, but if they participate in short-time work, then this claim will, of course, only cover the reduced pay. For pregnant employees on maternity leave, employees on parental leave, there are some special rules. So on the one hand, I think it might be just very difficult to get these people into short-time work all together, because an employee who is on maternity leave or who's on parental leave might not be willing to accept this program, because they will know that they are subject to very special dismissal protection laws, and that the company will not really be able to force them to participate in any such program. If they do, they will generally remain subject to the same benefits they have received before. So maternity pay will generally continue as it had before. Reductions by short-time work will not apply, but that depends again very much on the individual situation, and there are many different scenarios which can be covered, and that would need to be we would need to look at that in a bit more detail. Some more details on short-time work, I think, which are still important, are that, as we've discussed, you will generally need individual agreements with all employees. So having a works council, trade union, and so forth might make things a bit more difficult. Might make things a bit more easy here for a change. But in general, you can also implement this if you do not have a works council, because that has been asked, I think, by two people, whether that works at all. And you will also see that when you complete these application documents with the employment agency, they will have certain checkboxes you can check, and they will ask you, for example, how you have implemented short-time work, what is the legal basis. And while an agreement with the works council is one checkbox you can check, there also is a checkbox for individual agreements with the employees. But that you will need to note is that the employment agency will potentially want to see these agreements, look at them, and verify whether this has been implemented correctly with the individual employees. Another question which came up was whether it's also possible to implement short-time work kind of on a precautionary basis, and then decide to not really move forward with this. So that is, as a general concept, possible. So you could, for example, agree with the employees that short-time work is going to be an option, that you're thinking about this, and that they kind of grant their approval to participate in the program, but that you do not yet actually implement short-time work as of a specific date, but that this date will still be determined. You could also start with the application procedure with the employment agency, but only to a certain degree. So you can start preparing documents and so forth, but the actual application for these benefits will require that you have implemented short-time work. So that cannot be done as a kind of on a precautionary basis beforehand. But I guess that's kind of the question, and why this question has been raised is it might be difficult for a company at the moment to really determine if or to what degree they will need short-time work. So you might think you might need this, and then in 1 or 2 weeks or in 3 weeks, you might decide, well, we still have enough business, or business is coming back, and actually we need the people to come back to work. That is generally not a big problem. So you could implement short-term work now if you want that, if you need it now, and you can include in the agreements with the employees or with the works council certain rights to later amend the amount of working hours. So you could start with a implementation of reduction of work, maybe of 10%, but then if things develop in a negative way, later further reduce the work not only to 10%, but then to 20, 30, 40, or 50%. The only thing you should keep in mind with these kind of reductions or later amendments is that on the one hand, you will need to perhaps change the notifications with the employment agency which you have submitted. And also important, you should include certain notice periods with your employees. So you shouldn't, and you will not be able to force employees to kind of make these changes on a daily basis or something, but you will need to provide them a certain notice for these changes, generally 1 to 3 weeks. That is it on short-time work for now. I think there are a few more questions in the document, which we'll then tackle afterwards when we submit the written responses. But in the interest of time, I think we should quickly move on. Actually, if I look at the time, Anja, I know we have 10 minutes or something left, or 15?
We have 10 more minutes left, and then there's also a few people in this chat asking a bunch of questions here.
Okay. Yeah, then maybe let's jump through some of these here a bit more quickly so that we can tackle a few of the questions from the chat. Freelancers, maybe just very shortly. Freelancers are not subject to the short-time work program. They are generally just subject to their individual agreements. Employment protective laws do not apply to them. But, and that is a big but, what we are seeing at the moment is an increased risk of misclassification issues materializing. So if people are qualified or have been classified as a freelancer, but actually would need to be classified as an employee, that can result in problems now. So if you just kind of simply stop paying freelancers because you don't have any work for them anymore, or you terminate their contracts, it might be the case that people will try to claim that they have been misclassified and that they will actually need to be continued to be employed as an employee. That just very briefly. New hires also, let's do that pretty quickly. So generally, new hires which you have already hired or where you have already signed a contract, you cannot simply revoke that unless that has been stated otherwise in the agreement. However, what you can generally do, if you now determine that you no longer need the person you wanted to hire, you could already terminate the contract now, so trigger the notice period, and then perhaps this notice period has already passed before the employee would actually start. You can therefore reduce these costs and prevent the people from actually starting. You will also need to think about new hires when it comes to short-time work, because new hires will generally not be able to be included in short-time work programs only if there is a compelling reason that you still hire new people, even though you have suffered a loss of work and can actually not provide enough work to your existing workforce. For home office, we've covered the first one, I think, already. It's nothing you can force upon people, nothing people can generally require, but you will normally need an agreement concerning home office work to make it legally binding. Certain exceptions can apply in this current situation of crisis. And I'm especially thinking about more severe government orders. So if we have a real shutdown scenario where people are prohibited from leaving their home, then we might especially have a situation where it might be legally possible to request from people to work from home, even if they do not want to do it. So that they would be obliged to work from home, and if they then refuse, disciplinary action could theoretically be taken. But that would only be on a very exceptional basis, and generally also only for a very temporary period. Yeah, and workplace safety, we have touched upon that. Home office generally remains the responsibility of the employer. So what we would always recommend is that you assist your employees where possible, provide them with further information and guidance on how to appropriately set up a safe workplace also at home. Private sphere of employees in these times, I think, is also very important. So we have very strict German and European privacy laws, maybe one of the strictest in the world. And as a general rule under these laws, it is very difficult to interfere with the private sphere, with personal data of employees. It normally comes down to a balancing of interest of employees and of the employer. And let's maybe look at some practical examples where this is important. So what you cannot do is you cannot prohibit employees from conducting specific personal activities or specific personal travel. So while it may be very unreasonable at the moment to travel, if an employee wishes to travel, and as long as the government does not prevent him, then this will be the employee's free will, and you as an employer will not be able to prohibit that. What you can, however, do is you can request from the employee specific disclosures where you believe there would be a risk, especially for co-workers. So you can ask employees that if they travel, if they go to risk areas, that they let you know immediately, so that you can take measures, and you can think about how you want to react to that in order to protect your workforce. So that can, for example, include asking employees to stay home for a certain time, not come to work, to make sure that there is no risk for co-workers being infected. What is not permitted, and we have been asked about that by a number of clients, and I know that it is done in other countries, but in Germany it will generally not be allowed to conduct temperature scanning on employees or collect comparable health data from the employees. So I know in other countries, employers are kind of at the door to the office, measuring the temperature of employees and then sending people home who are above a certain temperature. This will generally not be considered permissible in Germany, as this is very sensitive data, and people are very much protected here. What you should, however, do is, in all of these considerations, is you should provide clear instructions and guidance for your employees, for office visitors. As we've discussed, I think in the beginning, for example, tell them not to come to work when they not feel good. Also maybe to limit the way people work together in the workspace if they're not working from home. So maximum number of people in a room, limit the number of meetings. If there are meetings, minimum distance people need to adhere to. All of this is guidance and instructions you can generally provide as an employer to your employees. In case you have a works council, things might be difficult or more complicated in detail. You might need to involve them on these kind of measures, but generally it's a possible way forward. We will we'll skip the most of it, but maybe just very briefly. If employees cannot come to work, for example, because schools for their children have closed, childcare facilities have closed, you may need to still be obliged to continue payments to them, normally only for a very limited period. So only if it's really required, if they don't have any other way to take care of the children. But then for a few days, you would normally be obliged to continue these payments. Afterwards, you would not be, and it would be the employee's risk or problem how to take care of this. But the government is currently taking this into further consideration, and they are planning to potentially implement further obligations for companies of extended payment obligations, but then in addition to these extended payment obligations, also implementing reimbursement possibilities. So you might be obliged to pay more for a longer period, but you might also be able to get that back from the government then, while schools are closed, while childcare facilities are closed. Then finally, or second last slide, I think, is other government actions. We discussed there's a lot of other programs available as well. These are changing more or less on a daily basis, or they are being expanded and opened for a wider group of companies. One important item which is currently being discussed is a delay in insolvency filing obligations, and I know that has been one of the questions in the Q&A, kind of what happens when you run out of cash. So normally you would be under obligation to file for insolvency. But there are considerations now that if you apply for government funding, for government support, and that is just delayed, and you run out of cash, and the government is just not quick enough to make these funds available, then you in the future might not be required to file for insolvency, but rather could wait until these funds have been made available. But that has not entered into force yet. This is something what is currently being discussed. This we will send around. It's just a list of some resources where you can find further information on the government programs, mostly in German. And we've also included a page to our firm response page where you will find further legal documents from our side, not only for Germany but for other countries as well. And this is mainly in English, so that is something which you can also check. Yeah, that's what I had to cover in these slides. So thank you for that. But now, if we have a couple of minutes, then maybe perhaps Anja, we can look at some of the chat questions and try to tackle these as well.
Yes, for example, Anastasia asked, could you please provide regulations which would be applicable to the working students working 20 hours a week? Would this category be provided with any governmental support?
Yes, so these employees, they will be in a tricky position because they will generally not qualify for the short-time work benefit. So at the moment, the regulations would provide for the company being obliged to continue their employment, continue to pay them. And there would be no specific government program aiming at these people. What of course you could always consider is amending working hours for employees, and then these people might later fall into a category which qualifies for short-time work. But now, if you're already planning for short-time work, then I think this is not really a good idea to increase working hours for someone just to get them into the Social Security program and then immediately making use of that program. That might result in complications. So yeah, I think this is indeed a tricky group of people, and students in general. They may also be student jobs, which are paid rather low. And these low payments will also result in them not qualifying for some of these programs, which is why we are indeed seeing an increased number of layoffs at the moment, affecting students because they are not under these kind of programs. Yeah.
All right. Well, I guess we have time for one or two more questions, if you don't mind, Nils. So Celia is asking, also in regards to short-time work, if the employer chooses to complete the payment from the employment agency to 80 or 100% of the salary, will the employment agency still cover the full Social Security costs?
Yeah. So if you go for 100% short-time work, then you as a company will no longer pay any of the regular remuneration, and therefore you will also no longer pay any of the Social Security contributions. These will then all be reimbursed by the employment agency. If you go to 80%, for example, so 80% reduction, and people still work in a 20% amount, then you would still pay remuneration in this 20% amount, and you would also pay Social Security on these 20%. So this will be a much lower amount then, but you will still pay Social Security on any remuneration for work actually done. So the employment agency will only cover kind of the lost work amount. Hope that answers the question.
All right, I hope so too. If not, as I said, just write us an email and we can establish contact. One last question. So that was in regard of the beginning. People in quarantine have to be paid even if they do not have a sick note. So I guess if they just stay home, if you don't.
Yeah. So if people are, and that of course depends a bit on the quarantine situation, but if people are placed into government required quarantine, then they will normally be issued with an order which prohibits them to do any work. And that means then that they are forced to stay at home, not allowed to work. But the applicable laws then require that the company still continues paying these people. But the big but is that in such a scenario, the company will have a reimbursement claim against the health authority, which has ordered this quarantine situation. So you will be able to claim back the amounts which you need to continue to pay. So ultimately, it would then be a zero cost model. You just need to think about, and you need to remember filing this application, and there are actually deadlines for that. So I think it's a 3-month deadline within which you would need to file this application for reimbursement with a health authority.
All right. There's just one last thing. I think it's 2 minutes past 5. I think we can do another 2 minutes. Because
yes, of course.
I'm interested also for our tools. There is Sabine asking, maybe more people will ask this question, but my concern is that we have some employees that are not performing. We gave them already some warnings, but nothing changed. We are thinking about to fire them, but we are not sure which is the actual situation with the COVID-19. Are the employees secured by the German level law due to coronavirus, or can we fire them because it has nothing to do with the virus? Is it about the performance?
Yeah, so generally the coronavirus is not affecting any of the German dismissal laws. And I think this could be a totally extra webinar where we only cover German dismissal protection law. So that's a very specific and to some degree complicated law. But so generally speaking, terminations are still possible. Coronavirus doesn't change anything with that. But terminations for performance in Germany are a very, very delicate item, and it's practically very, very difficult, and in some cases even impossible, to terminate for performance unless this reaches a kind of an area where it's about misconduct. So where an employee just simply refuses to work. So now, if you have people kind of making use of this times of crisis, just not coming to work or leaving early, then that will be a case of misconduct where termination will be easy. But general low performance is always very, very difficult as a termination if you're subject to German dismissal protection law.
And also, I guess it's important then to track those things in like features or tools with HR software. Let me ask you one last question. This will be the last one. What will be what will be those employees who have been stuck outside Germany? I suppose I just can't go through to back home.
So employees who are now in northern Germany and who would need to attend work.
I guess they were on vacation or something.
Yeah,
not really.
That's a good question, which I cannot answer 100% certain. But they will certainly need to do everything they can to get back to work. And as soon as they can, they will need to attend work. As an employee who would be affected by that, I would certainly recommend that the employee notifies the employer as quickly as possible and tries to perhaps offering working from abroad until the employee returns home. Yeah, that is something we would need to check in more detail how exactly, and it will also depend very much on the specific case how this has happened, because I think what would be problematic is if somebody in a time where it was already foreseeable that we might have border closures or where we have risk areas would still have gone on vacation, very well knowing that there is a specific risk associated with that, and then they are caught in that risk. That could result in scenarios where the employer might potentially not be obliged to continue the remuneration until the employee has made it back home, because you could very well argue that it's the employee's fault that he has been in the situation after all.
That makes sense.
But yeah, that's certainly something we can discuss in detail afterwards. So that if the participant just sends me a brief email or something, then we can certainly have a brief call and just look into that. Yeah, and that's maybe just one item as a closing remark on my end before I hand it back over to you, Anja. So anyone, we will of course send everyone, and that will Anja, I think, and Orgo as will take care of that. Send to everyone this presentation, this separate document with questions, but of course also feel free at any time to reach out, send me an email. We have some further documents and some kind of knowledge documents available here in German and in English, which we can send out at no cost to someone who is interested. So if you would like to have that as well, then just drop me a line, and I'm happy to share that.
Great. Thank you so much, Nils, for your insights into how to handle the latest developments and answering patiently all those questions. That was really talk, and I think we could all take away some valuable infos. So basically, the German government wants to make whatever it takes to get through this together without turning this into a major crisis. Also, thank you guys so much for joining and lasting till the end, and also writing down all those questions you had. As we said, we did record this webinar, and we'll send you a link to the webinar as well as a collected email of all the questions and answers of Nils about the most burning subjects. So you can actually read through, share the links, and basically, yeah, take your time to understand all the feedback. In the follow-up email, you will also be able to sign up to our free 3-month trial. till the 13th of June to implement those feature tools for establishing remote work. So we actually can help, for example, the second last question when people don't perform well. So basically with those kind of features, you can time track if they are on their desk, set goals, and make sure that everyone is on the know and on schedule. So the software makes working out of office really easy and intuitive. And if you have more questions, whether it is about the webinar or the OGOS or directly to Nils, we would like to connect with you and join forces together. So we look forward to hearing your feedback on the issues discussed here in the webinar. And yeah, basically, I hope you're all gonna stay safe and pop us an email if you have more questions.
Yes, thanks a lot, everyone. Thanks for organizing this, and stay safe and healthy.
Okay. So Nils, I will put all the new questions also in the, oh, okay, ich kann jetzt auf Deutsch reden. Ich nehme die ganzen, das sind glaube ich 7 oder 8 mehr Fragen, die würde ich jetzt auch in das File setzen, dass wir alle teilen und schreib das noch ein bisschen um, dann hast du alles auf einmal. Ja. Und ich glaube Ruben, der musste weg, der hatte ein anderes Meeting. Von daher glaube ich, können wir den auch einfach uns verabschieden und du kannst deines Weges gehen.
Dann vielen Dank und genau, dann
Ja,
machen wir es so und
vielen Dank
bis
dir für
bald.
deine
Und vielen Dank für die
Zeit.
Unterstützung und für die Moderation.
War sehr interessant und hat Spaß gemacht. Vielen Dank.
Ja.
Wir hören uns.
Danke. Bis dann. Ciao.
Ciao.